In this video, we're going to talk about neumorphic design. Neumorphism is a recent UI design trend. It's also called soft UI. Its designs appear to extrude from the background. Neumorphism is derived from new skeuomorphism. Skeuomorphism involves using user interface objects that mimic their real-world counterparts in how they appear and/or how the user can interact with them. Now, I want to be clear that just because this is a trend doesn't mean that you should use this design throughout all of your projects. There are a lot of issues with this design, such as contrast ratio. It can be really hard to see certain components with neumorphic design. So as with any trend or design concept, a little goes a long way. Real quick, before we get into the code, today's video is sponsored by Atlantic.net. Atlantic.net provides great VPS hosting, and they are offering a free 1 gig virtual server with SSDs and block storage for free for a year, plus $25 in free credits to use for other services they offer if you use the link in the description below. It's super easy to use. After I signed up, I was able to provision a new server in less than 30 seconds. Their servers are hosted across 7 different locations in 3 countries, with 2 additional locations coming soon. And unlike other big names in this industry, they have great, always available technical support. They also have incredible reliability and redundancy on their servers. So try Atlantic.net to develop, test, or launch your next project. Click the link in the description below and use the code STACKER to get your $25 in credit. So we're going to build this neumorphic styled calculator. The first part of the video will be the building and styling. Then we'll implement some JavaScript and put into practice a lot of the things that we learned throughout JavaScript January. There will also be a link in the description for all of the source code. Now let's get into the code. All right, so I've got a basic folder structure here. We have a CSS folder with our styles.scss file, a JavaScript folder with our main.js, and then our index.html file. So we'll start with the HTML. It's very simple. So we'll create a boilerplate with Emmet. We'll name this neumorphic calculator. Now in the body, we're going to create a main section, and this is going to be the actual calculator. The first thing inside the calculator, we're going to have an input, and this will be a number. And we're going to set the initial value of this to 0. All right, after this, we're going to have all of our keys or our buttons. So we'll have a div with the class of keys. And within here will be all of our buttons. So this one will have OP underscore key. So this one's going to have the class of OP underscore key, which is operator key. We're going to add a data type here of OP equals clear. So this is going to be our clear key or our reset. So we'll just put the C. So I'm going to use Alt-Shift down arrow and duplicate this 3 more times. So the top row is going to be the clear key, and then we're going to have the, we'll call it negate, which is going to be our positive and negative. The one after that will be our percent. And next will be the divide operator. Okay, so that's going to be the first row. Now these are not going to be clearly separated in rows in the HTML. We're going to do that in the CSS. All right, so I'm going to just use Alt-Shift down arrow to get this started. The next one is going to be a number key. So we'll just change the class here to num key. And then the number keys are not going to have any extra data on them. So this is going to be the number 7, Alt-Shift down arrow 3 more times. So the next number would be 8, and then 9. And then this next one will be an operator key. And this one will have some data here. OP is going to equal multiply. We'll change this to an X for multiply. And then let's take this and let's duplicate this 2 more times. So the next row would be 4, 5, and 6. So 4, 5, and 6. And then the operator on this one is going to be the subtract. So we'll add the subtract symbol there. And the next row would be 1, 2, and 3. And then the symbol here, or the operation, is going to be add. All right. So our last row is only going to have 3 buttons instead of 4. So we'll copy 3 of those down. And that is going to be the 0, and then the decimal. And then the last one will be the equal. So we're going to change the class on this to EQ key. And that will not have an operation. Change this to an equal sign. Okay, so this is actually all of the HTML. Let's go ahead and go up to the top here and include our CSS file. Oh, that's going to be in the CSS directory. Then we'll go down, and at the end, we'll include our JavaScript. And that's going to be JS and then main.js. All right, so we are going to be using Sass in this, so you will need the live Sass compiler extension installed. We're also going to be using live server. If you're not familiar with Sass, don't worry, I have a video on that. It's not hard. It actually speeds up and helps you to write CSS. Okay, so that's going to be it for the HTML. Let's move on to some styling. I'm going to open up live server so we can start seeing what it's going to look like. All right, so we'll go to our CSS folder here, and then we'll open the styles.scss file. Close the sidebar. And the first thing I'm going to do is just copy and paste some Google font in here. We're going to use Fira Mono. And then the next thing that I like to do is include some resets. So we'll set the margin to 0, and then the padding to 0. And then box sizing will be border box. And we'll set the background to a, let's see, E9. So it's going to be a off-white. And then we'll set our font family. And that's going to be our Fira Mono. And then we'll set a fallback of monospace and sans serif. And then we're going to set our default font size to 20 pixels. Now I'm going to hit watch Sass, so I have the live Sass compiler installed. And now you'll see some updates there. Now every time I save it, it's going to automatically compile the CSS for me. We'll start working on the body. Set a height of 100 view height, and then the width to 100 view width. We're going to set a display of flex, and align items. It's going to be center, and then justify content is going to be center. So that is going to center everything on the page vertically and horizontally. So if you're unfamiliar with Flexbox, I have a video on that. All right, now let's move on to our main container. And then within this, we're going to have some padding. We'll set to 2rem. And then border radius. I'll set that to 30 pixels. And I'm going to save that. And now we don't see a border. We don't see anything because that is done through shadows. The whole point of Neumorphic design is that it looks like it's extruding from the background. So the page color and the component are both going to have the same background color, but the shadows are what will differentiate the two. So since we're working with Sass, we are going to use some mix-ins, and that's going to make it easy because we're going to have the same shadows on a lot of different components. So I'm going to go ahead and create a mix-in, and we'll name this shadow. Okay, so we're going to include our box shadow here. It's going to be -6 pixels, -6 pixels, and 9 pixels. And the color on this one will be white. And then on our secondary shadow will be the opposite. So 6 pixels, 6 pixels, 9 pixel spread, and then RGBA black with a 0.4 opacity. Now we can include that mix-in anywhere we want within our code. So we'll add that here. We'll include shadow. All right, and then we'll save that. Now we see the start of our Neumorphic design. All right, so let's continue on. All right, so we're going to stay within the main tag here. We're going to do some nesting. So we have our input and our buttons. And what we want to do is we're going to remove the outline. So outline none. So over here, whenever we click on the button, you see this blue outline here. We want to get rid of that. We're going to use some other stylings to indicate that we've clicked on it. So you'd never want to remove the outline and not put into place some sort of other way of indicating that the button has been pressed. All right, so we'll save that. And now the blue outline is gone. Now notice here, when we hover, we have, this is a number field. So we have the up and down arrows. I want to remove that as well. So that can be a little bit trickier. I'm going to copy and paste some code here. And so the first part here, we have our input, and then we're targeting WebKit outer spin button and the inner spin button. And we'll set the WebKit appearance to none. So this is going to work on Firefox and Chrome. And then we have this second one down here, input type number, Moz appearance set to text field. So that's going to work on Safari. All right, we'll save that, and now those arrows are gone. Okay, so now let's work on styling of the actual input. All right, so we'll use input, and then we're going to include a shadow here, but let's start with the rest of the styles first. We'll set a width of 320 pixels, and then a height is going to be 60 pixels. And then we'll set a padding of 16 pixels top and bottom, and 32 pixels left and right. And we'll set the text align to right. And then a border is going to be set to none. And then the border radius, we're going to set that to 30 pixels. And then a text shadow. Now this shadow is different than the rest of them, so we're not going to create a mix-in for this. That's going to be a -1, 2 pixels, and white on the first shadow, and then the second will be 2 pixels. Oops, I forgot the pixels here. -1 pixel, -1, and then 2 pixels, 2 pixels, 2 pixels, RGBA, black, with a 0.4 opacity. All right, now we're going to create, like I said, a shadow on this as well, but the input, we want it to have an inset shadow. So we're going to go up to here to the mix-in, and we're going to just highlight this, Alt-Shift down arrow to duplicate it, and we're going to call this one shadow inset. Everything's going to be the same, except we're going to add the inset here on each of the shadows. All right, and so now we'll go back down to the input, and we're going to include our shadow inset. All right, we'll save that, and there we go. All right, now let's move on to our keys. All right, so the keys class is all of the keys, all of the buttons. And so we're going to set this one to display as a grid. Now, if you're not familiar with grid, I have a video on that as well. So display grid. We're going to set the grid template columns equal to repeat for 1 fractional unit. We're going to set a grid gap on this of 0.8 rem. And then a margin top of 20 pixels just to bring it down a little bit. Save that. Now it's starting to look like a calculator now. All right, let's move on now to the buttons. So we'll target the button, and we're going to include our normal shadow on this one. Just the normal shadow. And then we'll set the width on these to 60 pixels. And the height is going to also be 60 pixels. We'll set the border to none. And a border radius, which is going to be 30 pixels. We're going to set the cursor to pointer so that when we hover over it, we have the pointer indicator. We're going to set the background to, background to the E9 because we're going to be changing the background on hover as well. So we'll set that here. Let's save that there. That's looking pretty good now. All right. So now one thing that I did forget in the HTML. So I want these three buttons to move over. I want the empty space to be on the left. So since we have this set up as a grid, all we have to do is go back into the HTML and here is the 0. So right before this, I'm just going to put a blank span. It's basically just going to be a spacer. Now watch when I save that, that span now is here, it's empty. Since we have this set up as a grid, the span is taking up this row or this column in this row. All right, so now let's include some hover indicators. So within the button, since we're using Sass, we can do this. We use the ampersand symbol to target the button, and then we'll say button on hover, and we're also going to say button active. So when the button is active or hovering, we want to set the background color to CCC. And then we also want to target the button active by itself. So when it's active, we want to change the shadow from a normal shadow to an inset shadow, indicating that it's been pushed into the background. So include shadow inset. All right, let's save that. And now when we hover, we have the nice indicator that we're hovering. And then when we press it, it changes to an opposite inset. So the dark is on the top left, the light is on the bottom right. And then when we let go, the light is on the top left and the dark is on the bottom right. All right, so that is actually everything. That is almost everything for the CSS. All right, so now we're still within the main, and we're going to target our OP underscore key. So all of the operator keys, we're going to change the color on these to FF652F. It's kind of an orange color. And that just gives us an indicator that these are separate. These are the operators and these are the numbers. And I want to do the same thing for the equal key. What we'll do is we'll just include on this the EQ key. Save. Whoops. The class EQ key. How about that? There we go. Now all of those are orange. These are black. All right. So that is all of the styles. Now let's move on to the JavaScript and make this actually function. All right. So let's open up our JavaScript file. Go over here to our main.js. Close the sidebar. And the first thing that we need to do is target our input. So we'll create a constant and we'll call it input. We'll make it equal to document dot query selector and input. All right, so now we're going to loop through all of the number keys and we're going to set an event listener on them. All right, so we'll do document dot query selector all. And here we are looking for the num key. And we'll do a for each. We'll set up an arrow function here. So element arrow, and then we'll do the element dot on click. It's going to equal another arrow function. So within this, we have our, we'll set our input dot value. It's going to be equal to input dot value not equal to 0. I'll explain this in just a minute. This is called a ternary operator. It's a shorthand if statement. Or element dot inner text. Okay. All right, so let's break this down. So we are getting all of our number keys, so 0 through 9, and we're looping through each one. On each one, we're creating an event listener, an on-click event listener. So on click, each one of these, we're going to set the input value of our main input, and we're going to make that equal to a question. So this is an if statement. So we're going to say if the current input value is not equal to 0. So if it's not 0, question mark. If it's not 0, we want to take the current value and we want to add element.inner text. So the element that we're looking at is the button, and the button's inner text is the number. So 0, 1, 2, all the way to 9. If the input's current value is 0, then we want to replace it with the element's inner text, which again is the number. So something to keep in mind here, we're dealing with text at this point. We're not dealing with actual numbers. So what this is going to do is it's going to take the current value, which is 0, but it's text, and it's going to add it to the element's inner text, which is a number, but it's text. So this is not going to mathematically add, it's going to concatenate. So the point here is that I don't want 0 to remain. If I hit 5 right now, I want it to say 5, not 0, 5. And then if I hit 5 again, I want it to say 55. So let's test this out. Let me save this. Okay, so now if I hit 8, it replaces the 0 with 8. But if I hit 8 again, it will add 8 to 8, which makes it 88. It's not mathematically adding, but it's concatenating text. All right, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up a buffer. So we're going to set a constant and we're going to call it buffer equals an empty array. So we want to keep a track of the history of the numbers that we pressed along with the operations that we're trying to perform. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to use a for, actually a for of. So we're going to set a constant here of op name, so the operator name of, and then we're going to create an array here. So our operations are add, subtract, multiply, divide, and percent. All right, so we've created a constant, op name, and so we're going to loop through this array that we just created here for op name of. So it's going to loop through. Its first one's going to be add and then subtract and so on. Okay, so we're looping through those, and each one we want to document dot query selector, and we're going to use template string here. So we're selecting the op key with the data of OP that equals the op name. And we're going to say on click equals op callback and send it the op name. So we have to create this callback, obviously. So what this is doing is it's going to loop through each of these op key operations. So it's going to loop through the add key, subtract key, multiply and divide, and percent. And on each of these, it's going to set an on-click event listener. So every time we click these, it's going to call the op callback function, and it's going to pass it the op name, add, subtract, multiply, divide, percent, right? So let's go ahead and create this op callback now. We're going to create it above this. All right, so we're going to say const op callback. It's going to be equal to op name. So we're passing it the op name, and then we'll have an arrow function there. So we're going to say let current value equal parse float, the current input dot value. So in this input, we want to make sure that we are parsing it as a number, and we want to use parse float so that it parses it into a decimal point and not an integer. All right, so now we're going to say if the op name equals %, then we want to set the current value is going to be times equal 0.01. Okay, so what that does is we're trying to get the percent of something, right? So if I hit 20, and then percent, I want it to convert that into 0.2, which would be 20%, right? So we need to multiply the current value by 0.01 to convert it into a percentage. Okay, this is the same, this multiply equals is the same as saying current value equals current value times 0.1. Same thing, right? And so then we want to just set the input value is going to equal the current value. Okay, so we have just converted the current value into a percentage. That's basically all we're going to do if the op name is %. If the op name is not %, we'll say else. We're going to check to see if the buffer is there and the buffer length. So if the buffer is there and the buffer has something in it, we'll say buffer.push, and we're going to push it an object. The object is going to be value and then the current value. Okay, and then we're going to set a constant of result, and we're going to create a function called evaluate, and we'll get to that in a minute, and we're going to pass it the buffer. And then we will, after we've evaluated it, we will set buffer push another object value result, and then buffer push value op name. All right, and then set the input value, input value to blank. Okay, all right, so we'll go over this in just a second. Let's go ahead and just finish up the last part of this, else. So this is basically saying if there's nothing in the buffer, then we want to say buffer.push, and let's just copy this. It's going to be the current value, and then buffer push and that. Okay, so let's go through this. So when we call the op callback, it's passing it the op name, and we have arrow function here. We're getting the current value and we're floating it so that we can do something with the numbers. If it's a percentage, we're just going to convert it into a percentage and pass it back to the input. If it's not a percentage and we're doing some sort of an operation, then we're going to add it to the buffer. So let's go to the else first. If the buffer is empty, we're just going to put the current value into the buffer and the operation, add, subtract, multiply, divide, whatever that happens to be. And then we're going to set the input to blank so that we can input the next number. All right, so if there is already a number and an operation in the buffer, we're going to push the current value, and then we're going to evaluate the result. So whatever was in there before with the operation of whatever we're putting into it now. Then we're going to take that result, push that into the buffer, and then push in the current operation. And then again, change the input value to blank so that we can input our next operation. All right, so let's work on the evaluate function now. Okay, so just below this, we'll we'll add another constant here of evaluate. And we'll make that equal to buffer. So we're passing it the buffer. Okay, so within this, we're going to create some variables, constant of second operand. So we're starting with the second operand because we are going to use pop. So buffer pop value. And then let's just go ahead and Alt Shift down arrow a couple of times. The second one here is going to be our operator. And then the third one will be our first operand. Okay, so as we're pushing them into the array, we're pushing a number, and then we're pushing an operator, and then we're pushing another number. Okay, so we're popping, so pop pulls the last value out of an array. So we're pulling the last value, which would be our second operand. Now the last value that's left in the array would be our operator, and then the last value after that would be our first operand. After this, our array will be empty. We've pulled all of these out of our array, and now we can do something with them. All right, so now we're going to set up a switch. So we'll say switch, and we're passing the switch our operator. All right, so now we're checking to see if the operator is equal to case and. If it's equal to and, we want to return first operand plus second operand. Okay, after that we want to break so that it doesn't continue with the switch cases. All right, so then we'll say case subtract. We want to basically do the same thing, so I'll just copy this. We want to, instead of add, we want to subtract. All right, so we'll take these and Alt Shift down arrow twice. The next case would be multiply. And so we'll just change this to multiply and then divide. And change that to divide. And then we're also going to have a default. If we evaluate and there happens to only be one thing in the buffer, then we don't want it to do anything. We just want it to return the second operand, which would be the only value in the array. All right, so that's going to be it for the switch. All right, we can go ahead and save this, and let's see what kind of functionality we have at this point. So if I say 5 plus, now it's going to go away. It added the 5 to the buffer. It added the addition operator to the array, and now it's waiting for a second input. All right, so almost there. Let's move on to our equal key. All right, so we'll go after this for loop. We will target our document.query selector and the equal key. And we'll say on click equals, and this is going to be an arrow function. So we'll say if buffer and buffer length. So again, is the buffer there and is there something in it? So we'll say if there is, buffer.push. And it's going to be the same thing here. We have our object of value, and then we're just going to parse float the input value. Okay, and then after that, we are going to change our input value to equal evaluate and buffer. All right. If we hit the equal key, we should already have some numbers in the buffer, right? So it's checking to make sure that there's something in the buffer. If there is, we're going to add the current value into the buffer and evaluate it. Set the input to the result of the evaluation. All right, now let's work on the clear button. So we'll say document.query selector, and we're targeting our op key with the operation data is going, the OP data is going to equal clear. And we'll say on click equals arrow function. So to clear it, we're just going to set our input value. It's going to equal 0. And then our buffer length, we're going to set that to 0. So when you set the length of an array to 0, you're basically erasing it. All right, so let's save this and see what kind of functionality we have. So now if I hit 5 plus 5 equals, and we get 10. And then we can clear it. And I could say 5 plus 5 plus, something's not right. No, I didn't spell that right. Evaluate. Save that. Okay, 5 plus 5 plus 5 equals 15. All right, and so now again, like we were saying before, if I wanted to take something like 100, multiply it by 20%. So when I hit the percent sign, it just converts that into a decimal percentage. And then I can hit equal and we'll get 20 because 20% of 100 is 20. All right, so the last thing to work on is going to be the negate. So the positive and negative button. Okay, so that is going to be document query selector. And then the OP key with the data OP equals negate. We'll set the on click. That's going to equal a arrow function. And let's actually keep this all on one line. So this arrow function is just going to input value. It's going to set the input value to negative parse float input dot value. So pretty simple, one line here. We're going to query selector this negate key, the positive negative key, and on click, we're going to make that set the input value equal to parse float, the input value negative. Okay, so let's save that. So now if I want 8 and I want to change that to a -8, I can hit. Well, I guess I should add the class to this. That would make it work. All right, 8 negative. And then we could subtract 8 from that. We'll make it a -16. We can add 32 to that. We'll make it a +16. There we go. So let me make this a little bit bigger. So this calculator is by no means 100% functional. You're going to find bugs here. It does all of the basic calculator functionality. So the point of this video was to show you the Neumorphic design and then some JavaScript functionality. Again, when it comes to all design trends, a little bit goes a long way. So don't go crazy with the Neumorphic design. Be careful. Look for contrast ratios. Make sure that it's easy to see and always think about the user experience. Even though something looks cool, doesn't mean that it's functional. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. Check me out on social media and support me on Patreon if you have the means. We'll see you in the next video.